Velkommen til. Mit navn er Ditte Deinbol. Jeg er projektleder for det Velux-finansierede projekt, der hedder Grøn Omstilling af Danmarks blå økonomi. Den her webinarserie, den markerer startskuddet på vores projekt. Der er rigtig mange deltagere, det er vi virkelig glade for. Der var 100 tilmeldte, og nu er vi så spændte på, hvor mange der rent faktisk logger på i praksis i dag. Jeg skal lige starte med at sige, at Martin Lidegaard, han har desværre meldt afbud. Han er blevet kaldt til et møde i Statsministeriet. Det er jo, hvad der sker, når man inviterer politikere til sit webinar. Men det er vi selvfølgelig rigtig ærgerlige over, men hvad er det heller ikke? Fordi vi har med os Daniel Famir fra Duke University, og det giver jo så mere tid til at høre hans spændende oplæg og have en efterfølgende diskussion med ham, og det glæder vi os rigtig meget til. Jeg vil lægge ud med at sige noget om at præsentere WWF's principper for en bæredygtig blå økonomi og fortælle lidt om det her projekt, vi starter op. Skal jeg lige dele min skærm? Yes. De havnære danske erhverv, de har stor betydning for Danmarks økonomi, og de har også stor betydning for vores brand ude i verden. Det kan vi godt være stolte af. Vi har også store ambitioner for fremtiden for Danmarks blå økonomi. Det har vi talt en del om i forbindelse med udviklingen af den havplan for Danmarks marine områder, som er i høring lige nu. I WWF, der kan vi godt lide ambitioner, og vi deler stoltheden over Danmarks havnære erhverv. Det er noget, vi skal værne om. Men havnaturen har det skidt, og de marine områder i Danmark er i mange henseender udnyttet langt ud over, hvad havnaturen kan bære. Vi lever ikke op til vores EU-miljømål om at beskytte levesteder og opnå god miljøtilstand inden 2020. Faktisk så står det så slemt til, at det kun er havgrotterne ud for Bornholm, som har det, som man kalder god miljøtilstand. De fleste er meget bevidste om klimakrisen, som kræver rigtig meget af vores opmærksomhed. Men det er vigtigt, at vi ikke også glemmer biodiversitetskrisen. Den er lige så alvorlig. Biodiversitetsgrundlagen handler om grundlaget for, at jordens økosystemer fungerer. Det er økosystemer, som udgør grundlaget for vores samfund. Naturen er også en del af løsningen på klimakrisen. Hvis vi passer bedre på vores ålegræs og havbund, så vil havet kunne lagre meget mere CO2. Så man kan sige, at passer vi på havet, så passer havet på os. Den første havplan for Danmarks marine områder, den er i høring lige nu. Det er den havplan, der ligesom skal danne rammerne for vores aktiviteter på havet fremover. Havplanen handler selvfølgelig om at understøtte udvikling og vækst i vores marine erhverv, vores blå erhverv. Men det er også et EU-krav, at havplanen den sikrer, at vores omgang med havet er bæredygtig, at den udvikling af erhvervene er bæredygtig. Og desværre så må vi sige, at den havplan, som lige nu er i høring i den nuværende udformning, lægger op til at øge presset på havet betydeligt. Det er hverken bæredygtigt for havnaturen eller for de havnære erhverv. Og når vi siger havnære erhverv, så er det fordi, at når vi taler i WWF om blå økonomi, så taler vi også om de erhverv, der måske ikke opholder sig på havet, men alligevel påvirker havet gennem deres aktiviteter, som for eksempel landbrug. Det giver sig selv, at naturmæssig og økonomisk bæredygtighed, det går hånd i hånd, når det drejer sig om erhverv som fiskeri, rekreation og turisme. Det er alle sammen nogle erhverv, som er afhængige af et sundt og produktivt hav som grundlag for deres erhverv. Men erhverv som havvind, sandsugning, landbrug og shipping, som jo måske ikke er afhængige af et sundt og produktivt hav, for dem gælder der stadigvæk nogle andre faktorer, som har betydning for deres forretning i fremtiden. Det handler dels om, at tendensen i EU og Danmark, den går imod øget regulering af adgangen til havets ressourcer. De virksomheder, der ser muligheder i det, i stedet for trusler, og de virksomheder, som er på forkant og omstiller sig i god tid, de vil blive mindre ramt og have en klar konkurrencefordel sammenlignet med de erhverv, som venter med omstillingen til ny lovgivning tvinger dem til det. Det handler også om, at presset fra indkøbere og forbrugere stiger for en mere ansvarlig ageren hos virksomhederne. Risikoen for at komme i etisk uføre, den bliver kun, hvis man ikke agerer ansvarligt, den bliver kun større i fremtiden. Til gengæld så har det at agere ansvarligt og have et brand som en ansvarlig virksomhed, som har bæredygtighed i fokus, det er i stigende grad en meget positiv faktor for en virksomheds omdømme. Sidst så er finanssektoren også i stigende grad opmærksom på ansvarlighed i deres investeringer. Klimaansvarlighed, det har længe været et vigtigt parameter, som finanssektoren har fokus på, men parametre som bæredygtighed og biodiversitet, de er også ved at vinde indpas hos pensionsselskaber og i bankerne. Så man kan sige, at hvis vi vil værne om havnaturen, og hvis vi og vores efterkommere fortsat skal kunne høste af havets ressourcer, og hvis vores havnære erhverv fortsat skal være i front, også internationalt, så bliver vi nødt til at gøre tingene på en anderledes og mere bæredygtig måde. Med andre ord, så er der brug for af mange grunde en grøn omstilling af de havnære erhverv og af Danmarks blå økonomi. Vi har lanceret nogle principper for bæredygtig blå økonomi i WWF. De indeholder dels nogle principper for en klar definition af bæredygtig blå økonomi. En definition, som gør det klart, at den blå økonomi må respektere økosystemernes integritet, og at vi bliver nødt til at basere os på cirkulær økonomi fremover for at sikre velstand på lang sigt. Så indeholder de også en vejledning til forvaltning og et sæt nødvendige handlinger. Lige kort om en definition for bæredygtig blå økonomi. Hvad er det, vi mener med bæredygtig blå økonomi? En bæredygtig blå økonomi giver sociale og økonomiske fordele både for nuværende og for fremtidige generationer. Den gendanner og beskytter og vedligeholder biodiversiteten og produktiviteten og også modstandsdygtigheden i de marine økosystemer. Og så er den baseret på rene teknologier og vedvarende energi og cirkulære materielle strømme. De her principper, dem kommer vi til at formidle i den kommende tid, både på sociale medier og sådan noget, og vi kommer også til at sende dem ud til alle deltagerne af det her webinar efterfølgende. Men grøn omstilling er ikke nødvendigvis nemt. Gode intentioner er ikke altid nok. Der kan være rigtig mange barrierer på vejen. Det kan kræve noget teknologi og noget viden, vi ikke har endnu. Det kan kræve store investeringer, som først tjener sig selv hjem i det lange løb. Der kan være mange ubekendte, som man skal navigere i. Det kan kræve noget ny lovgivning, og det kan kræve en koordineret omstilling i hele forretningskæden af leverandører og aftagere og forhandlere. Derfor så er vi også glade for at kunne fortælle, at den her webinarserie, den er også et kick-off for et Velux-finansieret projekt, grøn omstilling af Danmarks blå økonomi. Frem til årsskiftet 2022, så vil vi gå i dialog med erhverv, brancheorganisationer, myndigheder, politikere og eksperter om, hvordan vi hjælper den her grønne omstilling på vej. Sammen så er tanken, at vi skal blive klogere undervejs, og projektet munder ud i en roadmap for bæredygtig omstilling. Og vi slutter også af med et topmøde, hvor vi sammen kan drøfte de næste skridt i omstillingen. Det glæder vi os rigtig meget til. Så det her er en invitation til jer til dialog, videndeling og fælles innovation. Og I kommer til at høre mere fra os i den kommende tid. Vi håber, I vil være med. Så langt. Hvis I har nogle spørgsmål so far, så skriv i chatten, og så vil vi vælge nogen ud, som vi vil svare på. Det kommer vi til at gøre efter Daniel har været på, men skriv endelig nu. Ja, fordi nu kommer vi til det næste punkt. And I'll switch to English now. Daniel Vermeer, welcome. Dan Vermeer is a professor and has spent the last 3 decades working on some of the world's grand challenges, including water scarcity, climate change, poverty, and ocean sustainability through diverse roles in academia and business. Dan is associate professor of the practice at Duke University, where he directs the Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment. Through teaching, research, and coalition building, Dan advances new approaches to energy transition, climate change, water management, and sustainable ocean use. Prior to coming to Duke, Dan led Coca-Cola's water sustainability initiative. As a recognized leader and practitioner in corporate sustainability, he's an active public speaker and author, and has worked with several leading companies and organizations, including Google, Walmart, Nike, General Motors, FedEx, Tesla, World Wildlife Fund, and the UN Global Compact. So Daniel is very experienced when it comes to green innovation in practice. Our colleague Henrike, she's been interpreting for Daniel what's been said so far. So he's with us. Daniel, you have promised to present 4 features of blue economy innovations with us. Before I give the floor to you, I want to tell everyone else, please, if you have any questions, write them in the chat, and Thomas will then, my colleague Thomas Kirk Sørensen, he will then select, read them aloud, some of them after the presentation. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's great to be here. I have a long history of working with WWF and have great respect for the work that the organization does around the world, and have had a chance to work in many different roles with WWF. So I appreciated the invitation. Also, coming from America, I feel like we have a lot to learn from the European experience in not only working in the ocean, but to do so in a sustainable way. So I accepted the invitation both to provide my insights, but also to learn from the work that all of you have done in this space, and the questions that you're asking. I think we can learn a lot from that process. So today I wanted to maybe go a double click deeper on some of the principles. I think WWF has done a nice job of framing up the principles for a sustainable blue economy. And what I'm interested in is to begin to populate our understanding of this through some real concrete actions. So the first part of my talk, I'll provide a kind of broad context on the imperative for a different kind of economic system than we currently have. Our land-based economic system has long been premised on exploitation of resources and labor to generate economic growth. And I think it's just that much more clear as we look to greater use of the ocean that we do so with a really different paradigm of development. So I'm interested in helping to begin to build our imagination around what that might look like. I have some slides that I'll share with all of you, and I look forward to the Q&A, the discussion part of the program, so that we can pick this up in some more detail. So I think everyone on the call is probably very familiar with the range of services that the ocean provides us every day. But for many of us, the ocean is sort of out of sight, out of mind. For those of you who live in coastal countries, this may not be the case, but for many people in the world, I think the recognition of a range of services that the ocean provides to humanity is significant, from oxygen, over 1 out of every 2 breaths that we take is generated in the ocean. Large portion of our protein and micronutrients come from ocean sources. Our mangroves and seagrasses and coastal ecosystems play a critical role in protecting our coasts. The broader ocean is fundamental to our system of climate regulation. We have this debate sometimes about whether oceans or climate are more important. I think that's the wrong question. It's an artifact of our language that we even separate them, because most of the climate is actually in the ocean. Most of the carbon emissions are in the ocean. Most of the the excess heat that humans have generated are actually in the ocean. So we need a really fundamentally integrated way of viewing these things. Over 80% of the biodiversity in the world is in the ocean, much of which isn't well understood. And as we go into a phase of looking at the oceans as another source for minerals to power a green economy, we're confronting ecosystems that we actually don't have a very full understanding of at all, and don't really understand the consequences of some of our decisions. And then, of course, all of us value the recreation and the cultural value that the ocean provides. I think what's much less understood by the everyday person is the role that the ocean plays in our economy. There's several established industries, and I'll talk a little bit more about the composition of this industry, of these industries in a moment. But, a range of things. I think for all of you, capture fisheries are maybe much more part of your kind of cultural awareness than it is in the US. Shipping and ports, shipbuilding, marine and coastal tourism, marine transport, a number of sectors of our economy, by some calculations, the seventh or eighth largest economy in the world is the economy that lives on the ocean. So this is a really significant part of the global economy. It's also a place where there is a whole set of emerging industries, from marine aquaculture, offshore wind, which is very well established in Denmark, but which is just now emerging in the US and in China, other places around the world. I talked about the deep sea mining, marine biotech. The medical school at Duke is one of our larger institutions, and there's a whole program in marine medicine and study of hyperbaric medicine. So there's large sort of intersection between human health concerns and the ocean. And all these are the basis of new industries. What we know globally is that aquaculture is likely to double by 2050, if not before. So we're looking at economic sectors that are growing really rapidly. Global shipping and tourism in that same time window are looking to grow fourfold. So this is not only an important sector now, it's an economy that's going to grow robustly, even compared to the rest of the terrestrial economy. And it will be made up of both those established industries as well as these emerging industries that don't exist now, but will be important economic contributors in the next couple of decades. Some of you may be aware of the work from Stockholm Resilience Center on the blue acceleration. They did a really interesting study a few years back looking at this phenomenon of the great acceleration, where a kind of super cycle of increasing incomes leads to increasing consumption, leads to increasing population, which leads to increasing economic growth, and that this super cycle has pushed all of the metrics of our impact of the environment up a very steep curve. So if you look on the left, everything from population and real GDP, but then how that translates in terms of things like the building of dams, water use, transportation, and so forth. We're seeing the same phenomenon happen in the ocean. And so whether it's in terms of the impact on coral reefs, the loss of mangroves, the number of wind turbines that are going in, the number of ships that are on the ocean, they follow that same sort of hockey stick of impact. And so as we begin to translate this economic activity in terms of the ecosystem, which has its own requirements, we can see that there's a potential real collision course, right? On one hand, there's a kind of bullish expectation about the growth of the ocean economy. But at the same time, all of the metrics of ocean health are on the decline in most parts of the world. And so we know from the past that the definition of sustainability is the incompatibility of these two things going on at this kind of tension long term. We know that we need to figure out how to better align these curves of a sustainable ocean growth paradigm. So where do we look to do that? The first is to get a better sense of what's the nature of these human impacts on the ocean. You can think about those in terms of 4 dimensions. We have a kind of extractive impact on non-renewable resources. And in fact, oil and gas is the largest sector in the ocean economy. We also extract renewable resources, fisheries, aquaculture, as well as these kind of emerging genetic and medicinal uses are extractive uses from a more renewable stock of the ocean. We benefit from the operational sort of access that oceans give us to do tourism, to have ships, cover large distances at low cost. Desalination and renewable energy are all ways of using the ocean for its physical services, its operational services that it provides. And we also benefit from a whole range of ecosystem services, from carbon sequestration, waste management. The historical paradigm of the ocean is that we extract as much as we can from it and we dump all the waste that we have from it. And because of the vastness of the ocean, that was always seen as sort of the ultimate sort of infinite store of resources, an infinite store of waste, that it could continue to absorb it. I think what we're seeing now is that that's not true. We really have hit the thresholds where we can no longer exploit at the full extent of the resources without depleting them, and we can't continue to dump waste in the resource without real consequences. If you begin to think about this in terms of which sectors are contributing these impacts, you can begin to sort of map out with the non-renewable resources, things like oil leaks and spills, habitat destruction, and so forth, are more aligned with the industries that are in that extractive non-renewable category. The renewable category, obviously overfishing is a area of huge impact. Operational things like pollution related to shipping, and I know that's very much on the radar for the shipping industry and their efforts to decarbonize. And coastal tourism, increasingly, I think, is aware of the footprint that tourism creates in places that are bringing in outsiders to see the beauty of the ocean and the resources that are there. And then the impacts on our ecosystem services, from chemical runoff, plastics, carbon dioxide and emissions, and so forth. So we can begin to get a sense of the alignment between the ocean use and what those impact areas are. Now, not all impacts are created equally. So some of those threats are more important than others in terms of their impact on ocean health. and some are easier to manage than others. So this is a beginning take on trying to understand which of these things are high impact and also are relatively easier to address. So things like managing oil leaks or chemical agricultural runoff, not easy, would require multi-stakeholder engagement, tense discussions about who will pay for these things. So I don't want to minimize the importance of how difficult these things are. But things like habitat destruction from deep sea mining, I think it's not well understood. We don't really know how that industry is going to grow. I think that's much harder to understand how we'll address. But it may be a vector of real impact over the next couple of decades. So I think we're beginning to sort of see a line of sight on where we should focus. I want to put in just a plug for the work that we do at Duke University in our Oceans at Duke initiative. I've left the website here. And what we've tried to do is think of the ocean ecosystem at multiple layers, like the real ecosystem. There are predators at the top. There are fish in the middle of this ecosystem in this food chain, and there's the kind of, micro protozoa and so forth that live at the base of the ecosystem. What we want to think about is where in this system can we intervene to have greatest effect? And I don't think there's one answer to that question, but I think we need a portfolio of strategies that intervene at each of those levels. In the rest of the talk, I want to just give a little bit of a snapshot of what we're doing at that top of the ecosystem, the largest companies in the ocean, who they are, how we might engage them. And then I'm going to talk about more at the lower levels, what are the kind of principles or vectors of innovation that can drive a more sustainable paradigm for ocean use. Work that we just completed in January, we published a paper on the Ocean 100. This paper has gotten a lot of visibility and uptake. I can point you to the source. It's listed down in the bottom left. It was published in Science Advances. What we did is identified the top 100 companies based on revenue in the 8 most ocean-related sectors of the economy. And we weren't sure what we would find. This is a kind of a Fortune 100 list, the biggest players in the ocean, at least on the basis of revenue. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're the biggest from the perspective of impact, but these are important economic players in the ocean, and that collectively could have an enormous impact in changing the way that we interact with our oceans. I know the script is really small here, so let me just give you some of the highlight takeaways. Number one is that 48 out of the 48 of the 100 companies in the Ocean 100 are oil and gas companies. And that only includes their offshore revenues, not onshore revenues. So what's interesting about that is almost half of the largest Ocean 100 companies probably don't think of themselves as ocean companies, because a larger portion of their revenues is actually coming from on land. But it means that it's inevitable that we need to think about how to engage the oil and gas sector in the future of our ocean, because they are the major players. They have an enormous physical impact, but they also have an enormous impact on policy and international agreements and all of the things that it would take to sort of shift the way that we interact with the ocean. The second thing that we found is that there's incredible consolidation in these industries. On average, in the 8 subsectors of the economy we studied, the top 10 firms in that sector account for almost 60% of the total revenues of the whole industry, meaning that just a very few firms make up the majority of the revenues of these industries. So it's highly concentrated. That can be a problem in terms of there aren't a lot of leverage points. There's a few companies that have enormous influence, but it can also make the engagement process easier, because to get to the Ocean 100, we would get to, a huge portion of the overall ocean economy and presumably a majority of those impacts. So they include things like, shipping, seafood, tourism, container shipping. There's even one firm, Ørsted, which is listed here in the offshore wind category. So this is a kind of an interesting subset that I think begins to sharpen our focus of how we might engage ocean players. And so we're using that paper as a way to build a coalition of these Ocean 100 players and build a common agenda that around ocean sustainability. So what are the highest priority, biggest impact areas that are also most addressable, also most aligned with the business interests of these Ocean 100, that we can really accelerate and amplify the kind of efforts to improve ocean sustainability. So we're in early stages of creating a new coalition on this. We're in the outreach process right now, talking to these companies about what impacts they have, but also about what role they could be in catalyzing more systemic action. I think all of these firms realize these issues require coalitions. They can't be done by individual players, and that forming the right groups of players is really critical to make progress. We've gotten very positive response from World Economic Forum, UN Global Compact, OECD, and other players in this effort. So we're quite excited about this, and we're just in the early stages. So I wanted to invite all of you who are interested in this initiative to stay tuned, to join us, and we are very much open to conversations about how do we really use this kind of focal point as a point of leverage to drive ocean sustainability. Let me just conclude with what I see as what I called 4 pathways to a sustainable ocean economy, and I'll give you a few quick examples. I don't want to take too much of our time here because I'm anxious for the Q&A as well. But Ditte talked about the definitions of the blue economy. What I see emerging are at least 4 themes or 4 pathways for the transformation of the ocean economy. And I want to just talk through a few examples on each of those. So the first, which may be obvious in Denmark, but which is really not as obvious in places like the US, is the role that the ocean will play in decarbonization. Maybe the most obvious place for that is around offshore wind, but it's certainly not the only leverage point in terms of our broader energy transition. I know there's a lot of discussion right now about the role of hydrogen, and hydrogen has links to the ocean economy in all kinds of ways. So a broader paradigm of energy transition and decarbonization puts the ocean in really a central role as we think about how to evolve this. I also think that there's lots of opportunities for improving the overall efficiency of the way that these industries work. Simple examples like these spinning sky sails that can reduce, not to change the fuel, but to reduce the amount of fuel that's used. There's lots of examples, I think, of companies that are experimenting with ways of really reducing the footprint. Now, what we found in other areas is gains in efficiency are often canceled out by growth of these sectors, ultimately producing more absolute impacts. So I'm not suggesting that efficiency is a sufficient strategy on its own, but it's an important complementary strategy. The second that I'm really excited about is what I would call a restorative pathway. In the last 10 years, the science and practice of coastal restoration has improved dramatically. Duke has a large marine lab, and this is one area of large-scale focus in the US, is how do we take degraded environments like mangroves and seagrasses and restore them to their biological function. One of the firms, one of the organizations I think doing the most interesting work in this is called Greenwave, based out of the US. It's an ocean farming nonprofit. And so they train ocean farmers in how to build aquatic vertical gardens in the ocean that have a kind of portfolio of different kinds of seaweed as well as shellfish that can be embedded into these gardens. The beauty of it is you produce multiple products, seaweed-based products, as well as the shellfish itself that goes into food supply chains. But there's also a whole set of environmental co-benefits, everything from carbon sequestration, nitrogen sequestration. The gardens themselves provide a baffling effect of big waves that are coming onto shore, reducing the impact of those waves by 95%. So a really new paradigm of how we use the ocean in a sustainable way driving new products and innovation, but doing it in a way that has positive climate impacts, both in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation. So I think this model begins to aggregate a whole bunch of the things that we care a lot about in a workable model that has real promise. We've been working with a New Zealand impact investing firm over the last couple of years in scaling this effort in New Zealand, particularly with Maori communities. So I think this is also an interesting opportunity to tie an environmental agenda to a social agenda in a really meaningful way. So restoration is a second pathway. A third is, and this is not true just in ocean economy, it's across the economy, but I actually think the ocean sectors have been the slowest to adopt the kind of opportunities that data and analytics and new science provide in providing really fresh solutions to problems. I have a lot of examples here. The two entrepreneurs on the left have produced a no-power handheld DNA tester. This can be useful for things like fish identification, where 30% of the fish in the grocery stores are not actually labeled correctly. So a DNA testing a unit like this that's inexpensive can ensure the kind of traceability and quality of the products that we purchase from the ocean. Bureo is a company that makes surfboards and other products using reclaimed ocean plastics. Cargill and a number of entrepreneurial firms have been investing in fish-free seafood substitutes. And so really exciting things in terms of creating alternative proteins, knowing that the protein demand in the world is going to grow. How do we do it in a way that has less impact on natural fisheries and ecosystems? Datamaran is a technology, an unmanned sailing ship that is wired up with a number of sensors that can cruise the ocean, collecting real-time data across a much bigger spatial matrix that's increasingly important as we think about the challenge of managing offshore wind and fisheries and shipping companies and tourism all in the same space. We're going to need much better data systems to do that. And then, you know, in your neck of the woods, Catapult Ocean is one example, but many examples of organizations that are really trying to drive innovation in this space in really catalytic ways. So I'm really intrigued by the literal explosion of these catalyst organizations over the last 5 years. I think the number is probably quadrupled in the last 5 years of these organizations that really see oceans as a site of new innovation. So we have a project right now that we're doing to try to build an open source database of these organizations, understanding what they're focused on and what are the most promising innovations that we can drive. So those are the four kind of pathways that I see. I'll just conclude by saying, I think the world has historically thought about the ocean like the left picture. We saw big continents colored by nation, which is actually not true. That's the way we've come to see the world. Focusing on the land with the ocean being the periphery. And I think we're moving into a world where this satellite image is a much more realistic perspective of the blue planet that we live on, that we need a more ocean-centric view of the world. People talk about the change in perspective that astronauts had when they went to the moon and seeing the Earth from a distance, seeing this big blue marble and creating a kind of overview effect, understanding the integration and the preciousness of the natural resources that we have. I think we need to help facilitate that same kind of paradigm shift from a kind of land-based view that we have on the left to the one on the right that really puts the ocean at the center of the story. I'll wrap with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dan Vermeer. That was a really fascinating talk and a great overview of blue economy and sustainability. And I really liked your shift of perspective in the end. I think that's a good starting point for our discussion now. So now I'll invite my colleague, Thomas Kirk Sørensen, has been following the chat. Thomas?
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Thanks a lot, Dan. So we have a couple of questions here. We have one from Nikolai Thompson. Is it possible to go from a less negative impact set to a positive impact on both the socio-economic and ecological systems with existing technologies and practices? And there's a follow-up question. Is it possible to have a net positive impact on both socio-economic and ecological factors with existing tech in the blue economy?
Yeah, those are really great questions. I do think that I work in the field of corporate sustainability, and I think the orientation of that field for too long has been focused primarily in lessening the negatives. So reducing the negative impacts. And I don't think that goes away. I think it is important that we continue to drive innovation in incrementally reducing the impacts of the economic activities we have. And those can actually make pretty large scale differences. But I kind of think about this, we need both a footprint orientation and a handprint orientation. Footprint is how do we lighten the impacts of the existing economy, which is not going to go away tomorrow. What can we do to drive efficiency? And the handprint side of the equation is where are the ways that we can rapidly scale solutions that either don't have any impact or actually may be restorative. So for example, we just worked with an oil and gas company on a blue carbon strategy. And again, I'm not saying that that is sort of problem-free, but I think the idea that there is likely to be market incentive for managing carbon in a more holistic way, thinking about not just reducing the amount of carbon emissions or even trying to get to net zero by 2050, which is the current paradigm, but really thinking in a much more holistic way about carbon management, the way that carbon removal and management of natural resources that are involved in the carbon cycle could have economic consequences, could be actually a lucrative, scalable industry of the future. So I'm interested that we do both of those. I don't think we can say either or. We can neglect the efficiency program in lieu of big new technologies that are coming. I also think there's a big debate in the energy space, which I also spend a fair bit of time in between the breakthrough crowd and the deployment crowd. So, should we be focused 100% on deploying the existing technologies that we have, solar, wind, batteries, smart transmission, smart grid, or should we wait for big new technologies that aren't yet invented but could be transformational, maybe fusion being the sort of ultimate example of that? So I think that's a debate worth having. And as an educator, I feel my job is to provide as much evidence as I can for both of those arguments and let those who are going to be working on these issues sort out their own convictions about it. My own view about it, we are much more limited by this kind of incremental approach and the inevitability of the existing economy, and much too cautious about the future possibilities. So my own bias is to try to amplify the parts of that are not niche, that are not sort of visually appealing, but not scalable. I think we really need to have a rigorous lens of what will provide real benefits, what can go to scale fast, what can attract private capital, and what can be done without massive unintended side effects. And we saw this with blue carbon, for example. Like, I think blue carbon fits several of those criteria, but blue carbon done at scale could have massive negative impacts on the coastal communities where those projects are done. And so I think we have to have a level of rigor that we have on the efficiency side that we take to the innovation, the breakthrough innovation side as the kind of formula. So I hope that helps.
All right, thanks. Thanks for that answer. I have another question. This is from Jesper Lund Larsen, talking about, do we have any projections on how many jobs that can be created in the blue economy worldwide? And follow up to that, are trade unions involved? you know, thinking about what kind of qualifications workers need for the future blue economy.
Yeah, I don't have the specific statistics on the workforce trajectories on this. What I know is they're widely divergent depending on what assumptions you make about how rapidly some of these things evolve. What I do know is that both revenues and jobs are expected to grow across all of these sectors at about twice the rate of the terrestrial economy. I think the balance of how many of those will happen in the traditional sectors versus the new ones is really an open question. I think it has a lot to do with how rapidly these new industries scale and how much investor interest they attract. So I don't have a good quantitative answer to that question. We're doing at Duke, we're hosting a global blue economy summit, which is focused on graduate students to explore exactly those questions. So we're bringing in people from both the traditional and the new industries in this space to engage with students over a couple of days to try to understand what are the trajectories that you can really build a career. And there's pretty high stakes. Like I work with graduate students every day that say, is this a place I should place my bet? Could I have an exciting career in this space? And what will that look like? And should I try to go into shipping or oil and gas, or should I think about some of these up and coming industries? So a big stake in the issue, not a real clear answer to what that looks like in terms of raw numbers. And I think, at least in the US, the engagement of trade unions, I think there is now an opportunity for that under the current administration that wasn't there before. So I think we're at a moment in the US that we're as open to engagement with organized labor than we've ever been. So that's a very parochial sort of view in the US, but it's clear for kind of these negotiations that trade organizations are going to play a huge role.
All right. All right, thanks. There's another question here. This is from Klaus Nielsen. He's saying, how do we get the politicians in Denmark to understand and appreciate restorative mussel farm? Just because we've had discussions about this in the Danish context, because we struggle with eutrophication in parts of our waters here in Denmark, and there's a lot of discussion about local impacts versus the uptake of nutrients on a larger scale. So is this a completely problem-free industry in the US, or does it come along with similar environmental concerns?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that question. One is, how do you manage the kind of environmental downsides of these industries? We've done some work with a company that is working in salmon farming, so not exactly the same sector that you're talking about, but there's an enormous, and this is not a direct answer to your question, but I think it's related. In that industry, they plan on 10 to 15% die-off of the salmon stock over the life cycle. It's just built into the economic models, you know, that you lose 15% of the fish that you grow to disease or heat waves or a variety of environmental impacts. And those have more, you know, impacts than just on the farm. They also have impacts on local environments. What the firm that we're working with has been effectively using data and analytics to anticipate these problems a lot more quickly than was able to do before, and also using historical data. These salmon farms have actually collected enormous corpus of data about ocean conditions, and you can start to really anticipate, well, what were the conditions that led up to these die-offs? What, you know, was it a spike in temperatures, or was there some contaminant that entered into the farming ecosystems at some point ahead of time? And then what are the set of steps that you can take to be able to mitigate or avoid those kind of consequences? So I think data and analytics can provide a kind of cushion and a capacity to address these questions in ways that we couldn't do before. The other interesting side effect of that is, one of the reasons that these assets have been difficult to invest in is there isn't enough data to really understand the risk profiles. So it's hard to get insurance, and therefore it's hard to attract investors because it's too risky to invest in these things. By building more predictability about ocean conditions and its impact on these operations, you increase the likelihood that you can secure insurance against these, because you now have reduced the margin of error pretty dramatically. And that's enough to attract a whole new class of investors to these assets that weren't there before. So I guess the sort of adjacent answer is, I think data and analytics, there's a whole set of new tools that can be deployed here that can have real impacts on reducing the environmental risks as well as negative impacts, and that can have knock-on effects in terms of their ability to insure and to attract capital.
All right, thanks. We have a question here from Anas, who is Anas Basri. I know him. He's the director of a chain of sushi restaurants here in Denmark that has quite a lot of focus on sustainability. He's asking, in your opinion, what does seafood look like in the future? Is offshore farming part of the solution, or should we go land-based?
Yeah, I would discount my answer to that. We have experts at Duke that I would much rather turn that question to. My understanding is I do think it's probably ocean-based. There's a lot of resistance to land-based aquaculture, at least in the circles that I'm in. And so I think that's going to be a really hard going. I think being able to have a really comprehensive kind of evaluation of the risks and the impacts is not there currently. So I think we're making these decisions based on an incomplete picture of the risks and impacts related to these different options. So I actually don't know what the answer to that question is. I just would say the wins that I'm picking up are more oriented to ocean-based solutions rather than land-based ones.
All right. Thanks. Now, we're kind of running out of time, so I'm actually going to steal a question for myself. And this is one that I've been thinking about for some years now, is that when dealing with, for instance, marine spatial planning, we're in the middle of a public consultation period right now. When you allocate space and you make political priorities, you have, on the one hand, very dependent sectors such as tourism, fisheries, conservation, if you consider that a sector, being very dependent on clean water, biodiversity, nature. And on the other hand, you have some very heavy sectors such as energy, shipping, who have a very high societal importance, lots of revenue, but aren't dependent on biodiversity in a direct way. How, I mean, there hasn't exactly been a clash of this in real life, but in the political prioritization processes, these things tend to clash. Do you have any comment relating to this?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that interests me to this blue economy paradigm is that the evaluation of risks and opportunities varies quite a bit across different sectors. Like you said, for shipping, they need an ocean that's wet. They don't need an ocean that is vital from a biodiversity perspective to be successful. So I think, though, that what we're seeing is there are indirect ways that this is still going to come home to roost for them. So as more and more scrutiny of carbon emissions goes out there, the impacts of these net zero commitments, to the extent that people are serious about achieving them, would have a dramatic impact on the oil and gas industry. So that's not an ocean argument, it's a climate argument, but it's one that's really gaining steam. You know, you probably saw the report from the International Energy Agency this week that shows the cliff that we need to be on in terms of transitioning away from oil, gas, and coal to be able to stay within a 1.5 degree threshold. And I see revolution in that curve. I mean, I don't see any like glide path. The glide paths we had 30 years ago are no longer available. So that's disruption. So it's a real moment of truth. The way I characterized it to the last presentation I gave is we sit in a very tight window between revolution on one hand and catastrophe on the other. You know, we really are going to have to choose which way we go. And so that's going to get ugly. and I'm not a politician, so I don't necessarily need to mediate that conversation, but I think that's the moment we're in. I don't think what we fully realize is the knock-on impacts that we'll have on ocean-based sectors like shipping. When you look at how much of shipping is shipping oil and gas and coal, it's pretty huge part of that industry. So what I think is going to happen is that there's an ocean-based argument, and then there is a kind of broader climate argument that will have unintended or unanticipated knock-on cascade of impacts on ocean-related sectors. And I think that'll play out in terms of shipping. I think that'll play out in terms of tourism. Look, I don't think tourism looks the same when people are on the move because of impacts of climate. It doesn't go away, but it gets reconfigured. I think protein industries get reconfigured, land-based versus ocean-based, and what actually comes out of the ocean and where and how it's grown. So what I see is there's a whole set of sort of internal dynamics in the blue economy, but there's maybe even more important exogenous impacts that will result in kind of dominoes falling in lots of ocean related sectors that aren't fully anticipated at this point. So I guess that's what I would look to as the process.
Thanks a lot, Daniel, for this really interesting discussion. I'm gonna interrupt you now because we are running out of time.
Sure.
So thanks a lot for contributing here. And I'm just going to tell all the other participants, I'll switch to Danish now.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And I hope that this leads to future conversations with all of you. So I appreciate being here.
We're looking forward to future conversations. I'm sure that it sounds like there is plenty of grounds for that from here on. No, I'll say the first in English to the rest of the participants, because we have been recording this webinar, and we will be sharing this with all of you tomorrow in a follow-up mail, and Daniel has also consented that we share the presentation, the PowerPoints tomorrow. So we'll do that, and there will be possibilities to circulate this presentation as well. Så vil jeg også lige løfte sløret for de næste webinarer, fordi det her det er jo den første i en serie af webinarer, som markerer startskuddet til vores projekt, vores Velux-finansierede projekt, Grøn omstilling af Danmarks blå økonomi. Det næste webinar, der sætter vi fokus på havplanen og på, hvordan vi tager højde for økosystemer i havplanen og for deres værdi, økosystem services. Webinar nummer 3, der sætter vi fokus på grøn omstilling, og vi har fundet nogle rigtig spændende eksempler på erhverv, som har gjort noget spændende med grøn omstilling. Så der kommer vi til at præsentere nogle eksempler. Og det sidste, det er en workshop, og der håber vi, at rigtig mange af jer vil deltage. Der vil vi invitere alle til en fælles udveksling i breakout-grupper, hvor vi skal snakke om, hvor er det egentlig, vi skal tage fat, hvor skal vi starte i vores dialog om den grønne omstilling. Så det glæder vi os rigtig meget til. Vi kommer som sagt til at sende noget ud i morgen. Der sender vi også noget mere om den her webinar-serie og nogle links til den her præsentation online. Så tusind tak, fordi I alle sammen deltog. Vi glæder os til at snakke videre mere om grøn omstilling af Danmarks blå økonomi.